The evening had been arranged with the kind of precision that left nothing to chance. The restaurant, private. The wine, selected 3 days in advance. The woman sitting across from him, chosen from a list of names that had been vetted, approved, and presented like a contract waiting for ink. Everything in order. Everything designed to mark the beginning of a chapter Davor Kadic had never wanted to open. He sat with his back to the wall, the way he always did, his dark coat unbuttoned, his posture too still for a man at dinner. The woman across from him was speaking. Her voice was polished, measured, every word shaped to impress. She came from the right family, carried the right name, knew how to sit in rooms like this without flinching at who owned them. His men had done their work. She was suitable. That was the word they used? Suitable. And for a decade and a half, suitable had been the most anyone dared to offer him, because everyone who knew him understood one quiet, unspoken truth. The man who controlled 4 territories had already loved once, and whatever had happened to that love had left something behind that no alliance, no arrangement, no carefully chosen bride could touch. He wasn't listening to her. He knew it. She probably knew it too. His gaze had drifted toward the window where the city moved in its usual rhythm of headlights and strangers and lives that didn't concern him. That was when the world folded in half. She was on the sidewalk across the street, half lit by the amber glow of a street lamp, standing still while the crowd moved around her like water parting around a stone. Her coat was plain, dark, nothing like the silk she used to wear. Her hair was shorter, pulled away from her face in a way that made her look sharper, older, carved by years he hadn't been there to witness. Mireia. His hand stopped mid-reach for the glass. His lungs forgot their rhythm. 15 years collapsed into a single second, and in that second, every wall he had constructed, every decision he had made to move forward, every night he had spent staring at a ceiling that still smelled faintly of her, all of it disintegrated. Then the girl beside her moved, stepping into the light, and everything inside him detonated. She was tall for her age, 15 maybe, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and a posture that carried something dangerously familiar. She tilted her head the exact way he did when he was assessing a room, the same angle, the same quiet intensity. And when she turned, the light caught her face, and he saw them. His eyes. Steel gray, sharp and unyielding, the same eyes that stared back at him in every mirror he had ever tried to avoid. The air left the room. Then the boy, taller than the girl by an inch, standing slightly behind Mireia with his hands in his pockets, his frame relaxed but watchful. He had her mouth, her calm, her way of standing like he had already decided how he felt about everything and simply hadn't announced it yet. But the jawline, the brow, the way his shoulders held tension without showing it, that was Davor's blood written into a body that didn't know where it came from. Twins. The realization cracked through every piece of control he had ever built. His fingers pressed into the tablecloth. The glass beside his hand trembled. The woman across from him was still speaking, her lips moving around words he could no longer hear because the only sound left in the world was his own heartbeat, loud, violent, and breaking. He stood without excusing himself. The chair scraped against marble. His man near the door stepped forward instinctively, reading the shift in him the way animals read weather, not understanding it, just knowing something dangerous had changed. He was at the door in 4 steps. The night air hit him hard, but he didn't feel it. He crossed the street without looking, without stopping, driven by nothing but the desperate need to close the distance between himself and those 3 figures under the street lamp. Mireia saw him first. Of course she did. She had spent 15 years learning how to watch for exactly this moment. Her body went rigid. Her hand moved without hesitation, reaching for the girl's shoulder, pulling her closer. Her other arm found the boy, drawing him behind her in a motion so practiced it looked like breathing. Davor stopped 6 feet away. Her eyes met his, and there was no surprise in them. Just recognition, then something that looked a lot like a door locking from the inside. He opened his mouth. Her name formed somewhere deep in his chest, but before it could reach the air, the girl stepped forward, out of Mireya's grip, and stared straight at him. "Who are you?" The question was blunt, unafraid, delivered with the kind of directness that didn't come from politeness. It came from instinct. He couldn't answer. Every language he had ever spoken abandoned him at once. Mireya's voice came from behind her daughter, edged with something that could cut glass. "Nobody. We're leaving." She turned the children away from him, her hands firm on their backs, guiding them into the crowd like she was steering them from an oncoming wreck. And Davor Kadij, the man who had made empires kneel, stood frozen on a sidewalk while the only 3 people who had ever mattered to him disappeared into a city that had just become the only place on Earth. The girl looked back once, just once, and the expression on her face wasn't confusion. It was recognition. 15 years earlier, the world had been golden. I need you to understand that, because what came after only makes sense if you know what existed before it broke. I was happy. Not the quiet, measured kind of happiness that survives on routine. The reckless kind. The kind that makes you believe nothing can touch you because the person beside you would never allow it. Davor and I had been married for 4 years. 4 years of a life that didn't look like anyone else's. Built inside walls most people would never see, surrounded by men who spoke in codes and silences. But inside those walls, inside the spaces that belonged only to us, there was warmth. There was softness. There was a man who held my face in his hands every morning, like he was memorizing something he was afraid to forget. I was not naive. I knew what he was. I knew the weight his name carried and what it cost to keep it. I had watched him leave rooms with blood still drying on his cuffs and return to me with the same gentleness he used to tuck my hair behind my ear. I had made peace with the contradiction because the version of him that existed inside our home was real. I believed that with everything in me. That was the version I dressed for on the night of the Ascension Gala. His family held it once a year, a display of loyalty wrapped in crystal and candlelight. Every ally in attendance, every rival watching from a distance. I was expected at his side. But that evening, something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a low, persistent hum beneath my ribs, like my body was trying to warn me of something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I had been lightheaded for days, fragile in a way I didn't recognize. I told him I wasn't feeling well, and he pressed his lips to my temple the way he always did and told me to rest. He would handle the evening, and I believed him, the way I always believed him, because trusting Davor had never felt like a choice. It felt like gravity. But sleep didn't come. The music curled through the hallways like smoke, and the unease in my chest tightened instead of fading. Something nameless drove me to my feet. I chose the ivory dress. The one he said made me look like I belonged to no era and every era at once. I wanted to see his face when I walked in. I wanted the evening to feel normal. The gala was alive when I descended. Bodies and voices and music filling every corner of the estate. I moved through it, smiling, nodding, and playing the part that had become second nature. But I was looking for him. Every room I entered, every hall I passed through, every cluster of men who parted respectfully. He wasn't there. It was Nadira who had been standing near the staircase earlier. My sister. 2 years younger. Always present. Always watching from whatever corner of my life offered the best view. She had moved into the estate 8 months ago at my invitation, because I thought she was lonely, because I thought family should be close, Because I didn't yet understand that some people study your life not to admire it, but to learn where it can be broken. The East Wing was quieter, private, the kind of silence that exists only in places where uninvited people know not to go. I walked it, following instinct the way you follow a sound you can't identify, not because you want to find it, but because your body won't let you stop. The hallway stretched long and dim. Our suite at the end, the door not fully closed, lamplight pouring through the gap like a wound that hadn't been sealed properly. I heard his voice before I saw anything. Not the voice he used in meetings, not the voice he used with his men. The one that existed only in the dark, only in the space between us, only when the world had been locked out. My hand touched the door. It swung open on silent hinges. He was in our bed, the sheets twisted around him, his body turned towards someone who was not me. And she was there. Nadira. Her auburn hair spread across the pillowcase like something that had been arranged, her body pressed against his in a way that left nothing to interpretation, her fingers resting on his chest with a familiarity that made the room tilt beneath my feet. The world did not shatter with sound. It shattered with silence. A vast, consuming silence that swallowed every thought, every breath, every version of reality I had built my life upon. He saw me first. His body jerked upright, his eyes widening with something that looked like horror, but I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore. Nadira turned slowly, and when her eyes found mine, what I saw there was not guilt. It was satisfaction, quiet, patient, deliberate. The look of someone who had been building toward this exact moment for longer than I could fathom. My name came from his mouth, broken, desperate, reaching for me like a hand through wreckage. But the woman who would have answered that voice had already stopped existing. I stepped back. The door closed between us with a sound so soft it could have been a whisper. And in that whisper, my entire world ended. I did not break. That is the part no one would believe later, but it is the truth. The woman who closed that door did not fall to her knees. She did not scream into the silence. She did not give the hallway a single tear, because tears required something I no longer had, the belief that what had been lost was worth grieving. Instead, I moved. The gala was still breathing below me, all laughter and crystal and people performing loyalty for a man who no longer had mine. I walked through it one last time, spine straight, expression set to the same pleasant neutrality I had perfected over 4 years. Someone raised a glass in my direction. I returned it with a nod. Someone complimented my dress. I thanked them with a voice that no longer belonged to me. Each step carried me closer to the service corridor that ran behind the main kitchen, the one used by staff who had learned that invisibility was survival. I had memorized it during the early months of my marriage, not out of paranoia, but out of a quiet habit I could never explain. Now I understood. Some part of me had always been preparing for this. My hands were steady when I reached the small room on the 3rd floor. I packed one bag in under 4 minutes. No gowns, no jewelry, no perfume that carried his scent. I took cash I had been setting aside in an envelope beneath a loose floorboard. Not much, but enough to disappear on. I took my mother's ring, the only thing in that house that had been mine before him. And I took the keys to the service vehicle parked near the east gate, the one the groundskeeper used for errands no one bothered to track. I heard him before I left. His footsteps pounding through the upper corridors, his voice calling my name like it could still summon me. Doors opening and closing. Orders barked to men who had no idea what they were looking for. I slipped out through the basement loading dock while he was still searching the 2nd floor. The night air tasted like diesel and rain and the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. The vehicle started on the first try. I pulled through the east gate during the shift change at 11:40. A gap of 90 seconds where the cameras recorded but no one watched live. I had noticed it months ago. I hadn't known why it mattered until now. The city unfolded around me in streaks of neon and shadow. I drove without a destination, letting distance do what thought could not: separate me from the life I was leaving behind. Every mile added silence. Every mile stripped away another layer of the woman I had been inside those walls, until what remained was something leaner, harder, and unfamiliar. I did not turn on the radio. I kept my eyes on the road and my breathing even, because control was the only thing I had left, and I would not surrender it to grief. Grief was a luxury for people who had time. I had minutes, maybe hours, before he mobilized everything at his disposal, and the head start I had was measured not in distance, but in his disbelief. He would not believe I had actually left. That disbelief was my only advantage, and I drove it as far as it could carry me. The highway gave way to secondary roads. The secondary roads gave way to stretches of darkness. I stopped once for fuel, paying cash, speaking to no one, keeping my face turned from the single camera above the register. By 2 in the morning, the roads had narrowed to the kind that don't appear on updated GPS. The fuel ran out near dawn. The vehicle drifted to a stop on a road bordered by pine trees so tall they blocked the sky. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, staring at a horizon that offered nothing but distance. Then I got out and walked. Every step hurt. Not from injury, but from the slow, grinding weight of what I carried. But beneath the pain, beneath the numbness, something else was forming. Something that didn't ask for permission. Something that ran on instinct rather than hope. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew what was behind me, and I would die on this road before I let it pull me back. Somewhere in the distance, past the trees, past the dark, a faint light flickered. Small, fragile, barely there. And I walked toward it. The light turned out to be a gas station sign, half its letters burned out, glowing against the gray of early morning like something that had forgotten how to quit. Behind it, a road curved downhill into a valley so narrow the mountains on either side nearly touched. And at the bottom, pressed into the earth like something the world had tried to bury and failed, was a town. Callow Ridge. I read the name off a wooden post leaning at an angle that suggested no one had straightened it in years, and no one intended to. The town matched the sign, a single road stitched through it like a scar, lined with buildings that looked like they had grown from the ground rather than been built on it. No traffic lights, no security cameras bolted to poles, no tinted window cars idling at corners, just rooftops and chimney smoke, and the sound of a world that had decided long ago to stop keeping up. I stood at its edge for a long time, waiting for it to reject me. It didn't. Callow Ridge looked at me the way it looked at everything, briefly, without interest, and then moved on. The nursery was 3 buildings in from the road's only bend. A low stone structure with a glass-paned front and wooden racks spilling over with soil trays and seedlings. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Help wanted. Early mornings, strong back, no complaints." The woman inside was older, built from the same stone as the building, with hands that looked like they had been holding the earth together for decades. She studied me from behind a counter cluttered with clay pots and shears. "You running from something?" Not accusation. Observation. "Does it matter?" She considered that. "Suppose not. I'm Odile. We open at dawn. Don't be late and don't break the terracotta. I've had it longer than most marriages. No paperwork. No last names exchanged. Just an old woman, a greenhouse, and a room above the shop barely large enough to turn around in. I paid in cash. Slept on a mattress that smelled like cedar and damp wool. Woke before the sun to water seedlings and sweep stone floors and learn the names of plants I had never known existed. My hands, which had once held champagne flutes at galas attended by men who shaped cities, now held root systems and pruning knives and soil that stained my fingernails in ways that wouldn't wash out. It should have felt like falling. It didn't. It felt like landing. Weeks stacked silently on top of each other. No one came looking. No black vehicles crawled down the mountain road. No one whispered his name in my direction. I kept my head down, learned the rhythm of the town. I became ordinary. And for the first time in my adult life, ordinary felt like the most powerful thing I could be. But the body keeps its own calendar, and mine was about to deliver a truth I was not prepared for. It started 3 weeks after I arrived. A nausea so sudden it bent me double between the potting benches, one hand braced on the wooden slat, the other pressed against my stomach like I could hold it steady through force alone. I blamed exhaustion. I blamed altitude. I blamed every plausible thing except the one explanation that terrified me more than the man I had left behind. But the body does not negotiate. The mornings got worse, each one arriving sharper than the last. Odile noticed before I said anything. She watched me lean against the counter one morning, pale and unsteady, and placed a glass of water in front of me without a word. "You should see Halden," she said finally. "2 streets east. He doesn't ask questions you don't want to answer." Dr. Halden's office looked like it predated modern medicine. Faded wallpaper, a desk cluttered with papers no computer had ever touched, and a man behind it who spoke the way old trees grow, slowly, with no urgency to impress. He examined me with a calm that felt almost disrespectful given how fast my heart was racing. Then he sat back, folded his hands, and delivered the sentence that split my life into before and after. "You're pregnant. Roughly 8 weeks." The floor ceased to feel solid. Everything I had built in 3 weeks, the quiet, the anonymity, the fragile scaffolding of a new life, trembled under a weight it was never designed to hold. 8 weeks, which meant this child had been conceived before that night, before the door, before the hallway. This was not a consequence of what happened. This was a relic of what existed before it broke. His child, growing inside a body he would never be allowed to touch again. I walked back through Callow Ridge carrying the kind of knowledge that changes the temperature of every thought that follows it. If he ever found out, it wouldn't just be me he came for. The danger had doubled. And the future I was building for one now belonged to someone who didn't exist yet, but already needed me to be smarter, faster, and more invisible than I had ever been. 5 months later, on a night so cold the pipes in Odile's nursery froze and the town lost power for 6 hours, I delivered them. Them. The first came fighting. A girl, small but furious, her cry filling the dark room like she had arrived with a grievance against the universe and intended to file it immediately. Dr. Halden placed her on my chest, and she opened her eyes before I was ready. Steel gray, sharp and unmistakable. Devore's eyes staring up at me from a face the size of my hand. The second came in silence. A boy, his entrance so quiet that for one terrible moment I thought something was wrong. But then he breathed, a soft measured sound, and settled against his sister like he had simply been waiting for the chaos to pass before making himself known. His eyes, when they opened hours later, were dark brown. Mine, twins. One who arrived demanding the world's attention, and one who arrived studying it. One who carried the face of the man I had fled, and one who carried the face of the woman I was becoming. I held them both in the dark, listening to the wind batter the walls of a town no one remembered, and I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I would burn the world to the ground before I let him find them. I named the girl Vesna. It means spring. The thing that comes after everything has died and the ground is still cold. The thing that arrives not because conditions are right, but because it refuses to wait any longer. I named the boy Ruin, quiet warrior, because some battles aren't fought with noise, and some people carry their strength so deep inside them that the world never sees it coming. My beginning. And my proof that the past never leaves cleanly, no matter how far you run. 15 years is long enough to build a life. Long enough to stop flinching at the sound of unfamiliar cars. Long enough for a town that once felt like a hiding place to start feeling like a home. Almost long enough to forget. Almost. Vesna was the one who made forgetting impossible. She grew into her father's face with a precision that felt deliberate, as if the universe had decided that no matter how far Mireia ran, it would send a daily reminder of exactly what she had left behind. Those gray eyes sharpened with age, becoming something unsettling in a teenager, too aware, too direct, too willing to hold a stare long past the point where most people looked away. She moved through the world like she was owed an explanation it hadn't given yet, and every year that passed without one made her sharper, more determined to fill the silence with questions that had no safe answers. Who is my father? She asked it for the first time at 7. Mireia told her he was gone. At 9, she asked again. Mireia said it was complicated. At 12, she stopped asking and started searching. Library computers, old newspapers, fragments of information gathered with a persistence that felt inherited from someone she had never met. She never found anything. Mireia had been too careful. But the searching itself told Mireia something that kept her awake at night. Her daughter was not the kind of person who accepted closed doors. She was the kind who removed them from their hinges. Ruan was different. He carried his questions the way he carried everything. Internally, patiently, with a stillness that made people underestimate him and a perceptiveness that meant he rarely needed to ask what he had already figured out. He watched his mother the way a physician watches a patient, noting the pauses, the redirections, the way her voice tightened whenever the past edged too close. He cataloged everything and said nothing, because Ruin understood something his sister hadn't accepted. Their mother's silence was not cruelty. It was protection. And whatever she was protecting them from was large enough to justify all those unanswered years. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. The nursery had become theirs over the years. Odile, now in her 80s and slower, but no less sharp, had handed the business to Mireia piece by piece, the way someone passes down a language, through repetition and trust, and the quiet understanding that some things survive only if someone else agrees to carry them. Vesna worked there reluctantly after school, her restless energy poorly suited to the patience required by growing things. Ruin worked voluntarily, his hands finding the same rhythm in soil that his mother's had found years ago. It was a good life, a real one, built from nothing and held together by stubbornness. But good lives have a way of making you forget why you built them in the first place. The trip to the city was Vesna's idea. A regional science competition, her project on genetic inheritance, a topic Mireia had tried not to read too much into, had been selected for the finals. 3 hours from Callow Ridge, in a city large enough to swallow them and anonymous enough to feel safe. Mireia hesitated, but Vesna's face, bright and expectant, made no feel like a punishment she couldn't justify. They drove down on a Friday afternoon, windows open, Vesna talking non-stop about her presentation while Ruin read in the back seat, and Mireia gripped the steering wheel just a fraction too tightly for someone only worried about traffic. The competition ended at 7. Vesna placed second, which she handled with the quiet fury of someone who intended to place first at everything for the rest of her life. They decided to walk through the city center before driving home. Normal things, safe things. And on a sidewalk outside a restaurant that meant nothing to her, beneath a street lamp that cast just enough light to be seen from across the street, Mireia felt the temperature of the air change. She knew before she turned, knew the way prey knows, not through sight or sound, but through something ancient and cellular, something that lives in the blood and never forgets. She turned, and there he was. And her daughter, her brilliant, relentless, unmistakable daughter, had already stepped forward. He did not sleep the night she disappeared. That would be said later as fact. But the truth was stranger. He did not sleep for 3 nights. Not from stubbornness, but because every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. Her face in that doorway, the exact second her expression went from confusion to recognition to something that looked like death without the mercy of ending. By morning, his estate had become a command center. Every exit reviewed, every guard interrogated, every camera dissected frame by frame. He watched the footage of her leaving through the service corridors 17 times before he stopped counting. She moved through his own house like a ghost through a wall, calm, unhurried, invisible to every person who should have seen her. That precision shook him more than her absence. She hadn't panicked. She had prepared. The search began within hours and did not pause for months. He deployed men the way other people deploy grief. Relentlessly, without boundary. Private investigators, digital trackers, contacts in every jurisdiction across 3 states. They found the vehicle abandoned on a back road 80 miles south, fuel gauge on empty, driver's seat still adjusted to her height. After that, nothing. No credit card activity, no phone signal, no hospital visit, no shelter registration. She had stepped off the grid with a completeness that humiliated every resource he possessed. Weeks became months. Months became a year. The silence she left behind settled into the walls of his estate like something structural, something that could not be removed without pulling the building down around it. He stopped attending dinners, stopped caring about territories that had once defined him. His men learned quickly that there were 2 versions of Davor Kadich now, the one who still functioned at the surface, and the one beneath it who was slowly dismantling himself from the inside out. It was during the 2nd year that the fracture appeared. Not in the search, but in his memory. The night had replayed itself so many times it had worn grooves into his consciousness, and within those grooves, inconsistencies began to surface. A gap between the 2nd drink and the hallway. A heaviness in his limbs he couldn't account for. The way Nadira had been in the room before, he was fully aware of how she got there, as if the sequence of events had been edited by someone who knew which pieces to remove. He didn't trust the suspicion immediately, but he followed it methodically. Tracing supply chains, questioning men who handled substances that moved through his territory without authorization, following money that looped through accounts designed to look like noise. The trail was meticulous, built by someone who understood his world well enough to hide inside its blind spots. It led back to Nadira, not just Nadira. A rival syndicate, the Holsan family, had been positioning against him for over a year before that night. Not through force, but through the only vulnerability he had never thought to defend. Mireya, the one person whose loss could shatter his focus and create the kind of collapse that no external attack could achieve. Nadira had been their instrument, placed inside his home by his own wife's trust, given access to his routines, his security gaps, his habits. The sedative had been introduced through his drink at the gala, a compound designed to suppress inhibition and blur the line between consciousness and compliance. He had not chosen what happened in that room. He had been engineered into it. The discovery did not bring relief. It brought direction. He dismantled the Holsan family over 14 months. Systematic, thorough, their operations collapsing in ways designed to look like coincidence until nothing remained. Nadira was harder. She had fled by the time the first thread unraveled. It took another 6 months to find her. When his men finally did, the encounter was brief. She was removed from existence the same way she had tried to remove Mireya. Quietly, permanently, without ceremony. He felt nothing when it was done, because none of it answered the only question that mattered. Where is she? Years passed. 3, 5, 8. The search continued in waves, intense bursts followed by silences that felt like surrender but weren't. He rebuilt his empire, expanded his reach, and solidified alliances that made him more powerful than he had ever been. And every night, he returned to a home that still held her absence like a temperature, and he understood with increasing clarity that power without her was just architecture without warmth. By the 12th year, his men stopped suggesting new leads. By the 13th, his advisors began suggesting something else. You need an alliance, a marriage. The Marzich family has a daughter. It would secure the northern corridor. He refused. 14 times over 2 years, he refused. The 15th time, he didn't. Not because he believed in it, not because he had stopped searching, but because something inside him had finally worn thin enough to stop resisting the logic that everyone else had accepted years ago. She was gone. She had chosen to be gone. And no amount of searching could undo a decision made by someone who had never needed his permission to survive. The dinner was arranged for a Friday evening, a private restaurant, vetted and secured. A woman from the right family sitting across from him with rehearsed composure and careful questions. He sat through it the way he sat through everything now, present in body, absent in every way that mattered. And then, at exactly 8:47 p.m., he looked through the window. They disappeared into the crowd within seconds. Mireia moved with a speed and precision that told him everything he needed to know. She had been ready for this moment for all those years. Her hands on the children's backs, her stride purposeful, and her direction chosen before conscious thought could interfere. Within a minute, the three of them were swallowed by the city's indifference. He stood on the sidewalk while the woman inside the restaurant waited. His men approached, reading the disruption on his face with the trained instinct of people whose survival depended on interpreting his silences correctly. "Cancel everything," he said, without looking at any of them. His voice carried no emotion. The absence of it was far more alarming. The bride arrangement collapsed in a single sentence. Months of negotiation, strategic positioning, and political calculus, erased by 2 words spoken on a sidewalk. The Marzich family would consider it an insult. His advisors would call it reckless. He didn't care. He had just seen ghosts made flesh, and nothing that existed before that moment held any weight at all. His men worked through the night with the cold efficiency of a machine given the only coordinates that mattered. The science competition was the thread that unraveled everything. A regional event, publicly listed, participant names and affiliated institutions printed in a program available online. Vesna Oren, age 15, Callow Ridge Independent Study Program. Oren. She had taken her mother's maiden name, or invented one entirely. It didn't matter. What mattered was the town. Callow Ridge. Population under 900. The kind of place that survived by being forgotten. She had hidden in plain sight, and the only reason the veil lifted was because their daughter had placed in a science competition about genetic inheritance. The irony was not lost on him. He left before dawn. Alone. No convoy, no security detail, no men positioned along the route. This was not an operation. This was something that had no protocol, because it had never existed before. A man driving toward a life he had lost, carrying knowledge he had never been given, terrified for the first time since the night she vanished. The roads narrowed as the city fell away. Highways became secondary routes. Secondary routes became gravel. Gravel became dirt tracks that wound through pine forests so dense the sky disappeared. He drove without pause, without second-guessing, without allowing himself to consider what would happen when he arrived. Callow Ridge appeared like a confession the landscape had been holding back. A cluster of buildings pressed into a valley floor, surrounded by mountains that seemed designed to keep the rest of the world at a respectful distance. He parked at the edge of town, engine off, hands on the wheel, staring at a place that looked nothing like the life he had built, and everything like the life she had chosen instead. He found the nursery within an hour, not through investigation, but through the simple act of walking through a town small enough to reveal its secrets to anyone patient enough to look. A stone building with a glass front, flower boxes lining the windows, a small hand-painted sign that read, "Oren's Greenhouse and Nursery." Her name on a business, her name on a life that had roots. He stood across the street and watched. The morning opened slowly around him. Shop owners unlocking doors, a dog crossing the road without urgency, the smell of pine and wood smoke settling into everything. Then the nursery door opened and she stepped out. She was carrying a tray of seedlings, her hair tied back, sleeves pushed up, her face turned toward the morning light in a way that made her look like she had been part of this town since before it had a name. She was beautiful, not the way she had been, polished, curated, shaped by a world that demanded perfection. Beautiful the way things are when they've been allowed to grow without interference. Weathered and real and strong in a way that made his chest tighten with something dangerously close to grief. He could have crossed the street, could have spoken, could have done any of the things that all those years of searching had driven him toward. Instead, he stepped back, further into the shadow, and waited. Because this time, the man who had torn apart an empire understood something he hadn't before. Finding her was not the hard part. Earning the right to stand in front of her again, that was something else entirely. Vesna found him first, because of course she did. He had been in Callow Ridge for 2 days, keeping a distance that felt like penance, watching from margins he would never have tolerated in any other context. He rented a room at the boarding house at the end of the main road, paid in cash, offered no name that could be verified. He woke early, walked the edges of town, and watched the nursery from positions that rotated. A bench near the post office, the window of the hardware store's cafe, the low stone wall beside the creek that ran behind the main road. He thought he was invisible. He had forgotten what it meant to share blood with someone who saw the world the way he did. She appeared at the stone wall on the second afternoon, dropping onto the ledge beside him with the casual authority of someone who had already decided this conversation was happening, whether he agreed or not. "You've been watching my mother." Not a question. Not an accusation. A statement of fact delivered with gray eyes that stared at him without blinking. He said nothing. The silence wasn't strategy. It was shock. A physiological response to hearing his own directness replicated in a voice that was 15 years old and completely unafraid. "I saw you 2 nights ago," she continued, her legs swinging against the stone. "Outside the restaurant in the city, and I saw you yesterday morning near the post office. You're not from here. You're not passing through. And you look at my mother like she's something that was taken from you." She paused, tilting her head at the exact angle he used when deciding whether someone deserved honesty or management. "So either you're someone dangerous, or you're someone who used to matter. Which is it?" His throat closed around every possible response. This girl, this child who carried his face and his instincts and his blood, was sitting beside him demanding answers with the same unflinching precision he had used to dismantle criminal empires. "Both," he said finally. The word came out rough, stripped of everything that usually protected it. Vesna studied him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not softness, not trust, but a recognition that ran deeper than either. "You're him, aren't you?" she said quietly. "You're our father." The word father landed in his chest, behind his ribs, in a place that had been empty so long he had forgotten it existed. "Yes." She didn't react the way he expected. No emotion flooding her face, no tears. Instead, she nodded slowly, like a hypothesis she had been testing for years had finally been confirmed. "Ruin won't want to meet you," she said. "He thinks you hurt her. He doesn't say it, but I know. And you? She looked at him with eyes that could have been cut from his own face. I think there's more to the story than she's told us. I've always thought that. A pause. But if I'm wrong about you, I'll make you regret coming here more than she ever could. He almost smiled. Almost. That's fair. She stood, brushing dirt from her jeans, and looked down at him with an authority that belonged to someone 3 times her age. I'll talk to her. Don't come to the house yet. She'll run again if you push. Then she walked away, and Devore sat on that stone wall feeling something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Not hope. Hope was too fragile for what this was. This was the terrifying, undeniable knowledge that the most important conversation of his life would be decided by a 15-year-old girl who had inherited every weapon he had ever possessed. That night, Mireya's voice carried through the thin walls of the nursery apartment, sharp and rising in a way that Callow Ridge had never heard. Vesna had told her. And 3 streets away, in a room that smelled like cedar and old wood, Davor heard Ruin's voice for the first time. Not words he could make out, but a tone. Low, steady, protective. His son was defending his mother against the idea of him, and it broke something inside him that he didn't know was still intact. She came to him. That was the part he hadn't expected. 4 days after Vesna's revelation, after a silence so dense it made the air in Callow Ridge feel heavier than the mountains surrounding it, the door of the boarding house opened, and Mireya walked in like she was entering a courtroom, controlled, prepared, armored in a calm that he recognized as the same one she had worn the night she left. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto a street where nothing moved fast enough to matter. She didn't sit. Neither did he. Vesna told me you've been here for days, she said, her voice even, measured, giving nothing. She told me she spoke to you. She told me what you said. He stood near the window, making no move to close the distance. I didn't come to her. She found me. She finds everything. The words carried something that might have been pride in a different context. She always has. Silence. The kind that exists between 2 people who once knew every sound the other made and now stood where even breathing felt like negotiation. You had 15 years, she said, and the steadiness cracked, just barely. And you show up now, while my children are close enough to be pulled into whatever this is? That's not what this is. Then what is it? The edge arrived, sharp and earned. Because from where I stand, it looks the same as it always has. You, deciding when to appear in a life that learned to function without you. I didn't decide. I saw you through a window. I wasn't looking for you. I had stopped looking. That landed differently than he intended. He saw it register on her face. The knowledge that he had tried to move on carried its own kind of wound. The dinner, she said slowly. The woman across from you. An arrangement. An alliance my people pushed for years. I agreed because I believed you were gone in a way that couldn't be undone. And now? Now I'm standing in a room in a town I didn't know existed. Talking to the only person who has ever made me feel like power was worthless. So you tell me what this is, Mireya. Because I don't have an answer that won't sound like something you've already decided not to believe. She looked toward the window. What happened that night? You told Vesna it wasn't what I saw. It wasn't. Those are just words. Which is why I didn't stop at words. For the first time, his voice carried something that didn't sound like control. The exhaustion of carrying a truth no one would hear for over a decade. I was drugged. A compound in my drink at the gala, designed to suppress judgment and blur memory. Your sister administered it. She was working with the Holzon Syndicate. They had been positioning against me for over a year, and they identified the one vulnerability I never thought to protect. He paused. You. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Every detail of that night, the timing, the setting, The way she positioned herself was engineered. I didn't choose what happened in that room. I was placed there. He met her eyes without flinching. I spent 2 years proving it. I traced the compound. I followed the money. I dismantled every piece of what they built. And when it was done, I found Nadira. Absolute silence. Where is she? Mireya's voice was barely a whisper. Gone. And the Holzons? Gone. She pressed her hands against the back of the chair, steadying herself against something that was no longer about balance. I raised them alone for all those years because of something that wasn't even real. The pain was real, he said immediately. What you saw was real. What you felt was real. The only thing that wasn't real was the reason behind it. She looked at him, and what he saw was not forgiveness. It was the collapse of a belief system that had sustained her for a decade and a half. The villain of her story was dissolving, and without him, the architecture of her survival had nothing to lean against. I don't know what to do with this, she said, and for the first time, the control was gone entirely. You don't have to know right now. You just have to know that I'm not leaving. Not this town, not this conversation, not this life. Not again. Ruan's voice came from the doorway. Neither of them had heard it open. Mom? He stood there, 15 years old, dark-eyed and steady, looking at Devore with an expression that held no anger and no welcome. Just the quiet evaluation of someone deciding whether the most important person in his life was safe. Mireya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It's okay, love. Ruan didn't move. His gaze stayed on Devore for a long, measured moment. Then he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, carrying a weight that didn't belong to someone his age. If you make her cry again, I won't need 15 years to disappear, and I won't take you with me when I go. Davor met his son's eyes and saw something there that no threat had ever produced in him before. Respect. Understood, he said. And Ruan nodded once, turned, and walked back into the street, leaving the door open behind him. It was the first door left open in all those years. It did not happen the way stories suggest it should. There was no single moment of resolution, no dramatic embrace that erased the years. That is not how a decade and a half of absence is repaired. It is repaired the way old wood is restored, slowly, carefully, with hands that understand rushing will only deepen the damage. He stayed in Callow Ridge, not in her home, but in the town, visible, consistent, present in a way that could not be mistaken for anything other than a choice. He rented the boarding house room permanently and began each morning the same way, coffee from the hardware store, then the bench where the nursery was visible but not close enough to intrude. Vesna came to him first. She always would. She brought questions the way other people bring gifts, relentlessly, without apology. What was your life like before? Did you ever look for us? Why did it take so long? He answered everyone with raw honesty because she asked with those same gray eyes he saw in the mirror, and lying to her would have been lying to himself. Ruin took longer. Weeks passed before he acknowledged Devore's presence with anything more than a measured glance. Not hostile, but held at a deliberate distance. He watched from windows, observed from across streets, gathered information the way his mother gathered seedlings, quietly, patiently, waiting to see what would grow before committing to anything. The shift came on an evening neither expected. Mireya had been reorganizing inventory when a delivery shelf collapsed, heavy ceramic pots shattering across the floor, brackets giving way in a cascade that sent her stumbling backward. Devore was through the door before the last piece hit the ground, instinct overriding every boundary. He caught her arm, steadied her, swept broken pottery from her path. Ruin arrived 30 seconds later, breathless, and stopped in the doorway. He looked at his mother, at Devore's hand on her arm, at the broken shelving. And for the first time, something in his expression changed. Not trust. Not yet. but the recognition that this man had moved toward danger to protect the person Ruin loved most. That night, Ruin sat at the kitchen table while Devor repaired the shelf brackets with borrowed tools. No words were exchanged for the first 20 minutes. Then, without looking up from the book he was reading, Ruin spoke. "You use a Phillips head for that kind of bracket, not a flathead." Devor looked at the screw in his hand, looked at his son, and changed the screwdriver. It was the smallest thing. It was everything. Mireia watched it all from the spaces between resistance and exhaustion. Forgiveness, for her, was not an event, but a process. A slow dismantling of walls that had kept her alive. She allowed his presence, his conversations with Vesna, the cautious connection forming with Ruin. But she kept her own distance, holding it like a breath she wasn't ready to release. The night it changed was a Tuesday, late. The town so quiet you could hear the creak from inside the apartment. Vesna asleep, Ruin reading, Mireia sitting on the front step, staring at the dark outline of the mountains when she heard footsteps and knew without turning who they belonged to. He sat beside her on the step, not close enough to touch, close enough to share the silence. "I don't know how to trust you again," she said, and the words carried no anger, just truth, bare and undecorated. "I know. I built everything here around the idea that you were someone I needed to protect them from, and now that idea is gone, and I don't know what to replace it with." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Quieter than the man who commanded, quieter than the man who searched, quieter even than the man who waited. "You don't have to replace it with me," he said. "You just have to let the space exist. And I'll be here, in whatever part of it you decide I'm allowed to stand in." She looked at him then, and what she saw was not the man she had married, and not the man she had fled. It was someone shaped by the same years that had shaped her, worn down, rebuilt, carrying scars that mapped the same loss from the opposite side. She didn't lean into him, not yet, but she didn't move away. And in that stillness, in the space between a mountain town silence and two people who had survived the same destruction from different ends, something began. Not with words or promises or declarations, with presence. With the simple, terrifying act of choosing to remain. Weeks later, on a morning where the light came through the nursery windows in that particular way that makes ordinary things look like they've been there forever, Vesna placed a small terracotta pot on the counter in front of Mireia. Inside it, a seedling, barely an inch tall, fragile, stubbornly green. "I planted it the day he got here," she said. "Ruin watered it when I forgot." Mireia stared at it for a long time. Then she looked up at her daughter, at those gray eyes that would never stop demanding truth from the world, and felt something crack open inside her that was not breaking. It was making room. She placed the pot in the window where the morning light hit strongest, and outside, walking up the main road with 2 coffees in hand and a patience that had been forged in fire, Devor saw it. The small green thing in the window of a life he had not earned back yet, but would spend every remaining day trying to deserve. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. The door was already open.